What's happening, folks? Last chapter, going to deal with race. Certainly one of the primary categories in the discipline of sociology. Very contentious, and um, yeah, no matter what, we'll just be scratching the surface with this chapter, but it's an extremely important one. So, um, when we talk about race, we talk about race being a myth. A social construction. Race can be defined as a group of people who share a set of characteristics, usually physical ones, and are said to share a common bloodline. Racism is the belief that members of separate races possess different and unequal human traits. I think of it as discrimination plus power. Some people argue that racism is no longer an issue in the United States. Well, we know that's not the case. It's true that our race relations have changed, but many sociologists argue that racism has not been eliminated. If there's one thing that the Trump presidency has brought out in the United States is that racism still does exist. And unfortunately, there's a significant number of people within this country who still harbor ill will to people of color, simply because they are people of color. In the past, it was socially acceptable in many places to display racist attitudes, to use racial slurs. That's not politically correct or acceptable anymore, so people tend to reserve their attitudes until they know they are in like-minded company. However, there is no way means that this in no way means that racism has been eliminated. It's just more difficult sometimes to identify. But if you find yourself in a group of people that are all the same color, all from the same background, it's very interesting to hear what they have to say. Some things, the assumptions made by the group that you would share don't always make you feel comfortable, let's just put it that way. So, race is a social construct that changes over time and across different contexts. As with all other social constructs, we made it up. Humans, regardless of their race, are 99.9% genetically identical. However, race is still used to classify people, and sometimes race is a basis for differential treatment of individuals or groups of people. Sociologists have come to understand race as a social category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. Race is more meaningful to us on the social level than it is on the biological level. We just don't find support for the difference and meaningful difference in the biology. If there's one thing that modern science has done, is it's proven to us that once we get below skin color, we all pretty much are the same. To be white in America, for example, went from being a somewhat inclusive category in the late 18th century to being much more narrowly defined in the mid to late 19th century, and then shifted back to a broader definition in the mid 20th century. All these changes were in response to social realities. In places like ancient Greece and Rome, the idea of race did not exist as we know it today. People recognized broad physical differences, but they did not discriminate based on those skin color differences. As Europeans came into contact with different cultures during the Age of Exploration, racism was used as a way to justify conquest and colonization of foreign lands. In the United States, early on, before we were the United States, when we were British colonies, we differentiated way more on, I mean, you did not differentiate on skin color per se. You were much more likely to differentiate based on class or religious preference than skin color. But as white Europeans went on their conquests, they used the concept of race to dehumanize the other and to justify their conquest and colonization of those populations. When you think about the concept of race, many historical efforts to explain race were biased due to ethnocentrism, the judgment of the groups by one's own standards and values. In the 19th century, a number of scientists and thinkers researched and attempted to explain racial differences. However, what they were really doing was explaining white superiority. You can find all kinds of scientific arguments to support white superiority throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s. You'll be watching a video on race, the power of an illusion, and it'll get into some of these science, some of the science, and it's all been debunked. And as I said, science today has pretty much solved the issue of race as we've begun to be able to break things down at the genetic level and at the chromosomal level. We can figure out where we come from, and there's no pure species out there. There's no pure race, one race over another. We're a mixed breed. Just the way it is, folks. One of the more important concepts that was used scientifically to support this racist ideology was social Darwinism. This is another 19th century theory. And it was the notion that some groups of races evolved more than others and were better fit to survive and even rule other races. This is where survival of the fittest actually comes from. Darwin did not say it. It was the social Darwinists that made it up. They used Darwin's theories to explain how things socially evolve, and there's a lot of problems with going from a biological argument where Darwin's talking about the shifting in origin of species over really long periods of time. The environment would favor certain looks of a species, and the species would adapt to reproduce more of what the environment favors. Social Darwinists are talking about the quick social changes within society in a way like Darwin talks about the changing of species over time. And as I said, I just don't think that that's an appropriate, and it's been proven to be extremely problematic way of thinking about Darwin's theories of evolution. Of course, there's the backers of eugenics, the science of genetic lines and the inheritable traits they pass on from generation to generation, which claimed that traits could be traced through bloodlines and bred into populations for positive traits or out of them for negative traits. This thinking influenced immigration policy in the early 20th century, as undesirable populations were kept out of the country so as not to pollute the native white population. And the federal government sponsored a eugenics program. They sterilized a lot of Native American women without their consent during the late 19th century and the early 20th century, and into the 20th century, not the early 20th century, probably up into the 1960s. So the federal government was in on this as well, folks. This was a policy that permeated all levels of power in our society, and it was all based on white superiority. The concept of race is a problematic one as well, because what you're doing is you're identifying people by the color of their skin, and this is ultimately this comes from a position of power. And the one drop rule, which evolved from the U.S. laws forbidding miscegenation or mixed racing, was the belief that one drop of black blood makes a person black. Application of this rule kept the white population pure and lumped anyone with black blood into one category. This rule was critical in the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson, which ultimately upheld the Jim Crow laws in the South. This was a serious matter, folks. The idea of race mixing in the United States in the 1800s and the 1900s was extremely problematic. It wasn't until the late 1900s that we began to accept that whites could be with blacks and whites could be with Latinos and whites could be with Native Americans. So as I was saying, miscegenation is the technical term for multiracial marriage, and it was illegal throughout the states until 1967, when the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in Loving versus Virginia that anti-miscegenation laws are unconstitutional. With this ruling, these laws were invalidated in the remaining 16 states that had them at that time. The Loving case is interesting because this couple, a black woman and a white man, went to Washington, D.C. in the early 1960s, and they married legally, because in Washington, D.C., people of different races could actually marry. And then they came back to Virginia, and someone reported on them in Virginia, and they were immediately arrested. And they were arrested numerous times over the course of their marriage. They were kicked out of the state of Virginia, and ultimately the case goes to the Supreme Court and challenges these ideas of miscegenation and really pushes the United States into some places that we had never been before. As I said, DNA testing is used today to determine one's racial makeup. And while the process may be more accurate on some level than the 19th century racial measures, it still supports the notion of fixed biological racial differences. But at the same time, it is breaking down the barriers of how we understand that difference and whether it's scientifically defendable.